Hey guys, welcome back to another AP Simplified video. Today we're going to be talking about Unit 4, which is Earth Systems and Resources. So let's start off by talking about layers of the Earth and plate tectonics. Okay, so here are the layers of the Earth. Let me zoom in real quick. So as you can see, the closer you get to the center of the Earth, the more dense matter becomes. So the very most center of the Earth is called the inner core. It's completely solid. And right side of the inner core, we have the outer core, which is liquid. Both the inner core and the outer core make up the core. So the core is pretty much this right here. And they believe, or scientists believe, that the core is made mostly of metal, more specifically iron and nickel. Just outside of the core, surrounding the core, we have the mantle, which is made up of all these layers here. Um, one layer of the mantle we're going to focus on specifically is the asthenosphere, specifically because that's where plate tectonics are located, and we'll talk about that in just a second. So right above the mantle, we have the lithosphere. And the lithosphere is made up of the crust and the uppermost solid mantle, which is the uppermost solid mantle. So pretty much the crust is closest to the surface of the Earth. Okay, so now let's talk about uh, plate tectonics. And as I mentioned before, the tectonic plates are located in the asthenosphere. So before we actually talk about the plates themselves, uh, let's take a look at plate boundaries. So there's three types of plate boundaries you should be familiar with. The first one is a convergent plate boundary. It's also called a subduction zone. So a convergent plate boundary is when two plates um, sort of collide with one another. They're going towards one another. So what usually ends up happening is one plate slides under the other. Um, and that's what creates your uh, subduction zone. Uh, Usually a trench forms in the subduction zone of convergent plate boundaries, so be familiar with that. Next, we're moving on to divergent plate boundaries. It's pretty much, I would consider the opposite of a convergent plate boundary. Really focus on the word divergent. And if you're familiar with that word, you understand that divergent means to go away from one another. So in this instance, the plates are going to move away from one another, as these arrows indicate. Um, and as a result, instead of having something like a trench forming when you have a convergent plate boundary, in a divergent plate boundary, you're actually going to have a spreading center. And for our final plate boundary, we're going to discuss uh, the transform plate boundary. This plate boundary is also called the strike slip. Um, and the reason why is because in this instance, the two plates are rubbing against each other in opposite directions. So as a result, what you often see with this type of plate boundary is a lot of earthquakes, because what ends up happening is as these plates rub against each other, there's a lot of pressure build up. And as that pressure builds up, um, it's going to uh, build up to a point in which uh, the pressure has to release. So what ends up happening is the plates uh, suddenly slide past one another very abruptly, and this is what would create an earthquake. Okay, so here's just another quick diagram, which pretty much talks about all of the types of plate boundaries. Um, and one thing the College Board wants you to understand is that Depending on the plate boundary, different um, land formations are going to occur. So just I would study um, this diagram because it goes over that very well. So just be familiar with those land formations that form as a result of the plate boundaries. Okay, so we talked about plate boundaries. Now let's actually look at the plates themselves. So here are all the plates. As you can see, there's a lot of geological activity um, occurring in between each plate. And this is, of course, because of the plate boundaries. Um, and as you can see, um, all three types of plate boundaries occur uh, across all the plates. So in some instances, we have a lot of convergent plate boundaries, and others we have a lot of divergent plate boundaries. And of course, wherever there's a lot of earthquakes, you should expect a lot of um, strike slip plate boundaries. Okay, now let's move on to soil composition and erosion. So composition of soil pretty much just means what the soil is made of. And the composition depends on several factors, which includes what parent material the soil is made of. So, parent material is pretty much the rock material below soil horizons. So, just know that um, depending on what type of parent material is below the soil horizons, which we'll talk about in a second, um, it's going to change what exactly the soil is made up of. And um, another thing that changes soil composition is the environment. So, what humidity is it exposed to? What temperatures are it exposed to? All these factors are going to contribute to what the soil looks like, what it's made up of. Um, and another factor are the presence of biotic factors. So, biotic factors such as vegetation um, and things of that sort, dead organisms, etc. What they're going to do is enrich the soil with nutrients. So the presence of biotic factors is extremely important to the quality of your soil and what exactly it's made up of. Okay, so here are the soil horizons to our left, sorry, to our right. Okay, so it's pretty simple. These are the horizons. Just know that at the top is our organic layer. So the organic layer is the most nutrient dense. Um, this is because this is where all the organic material collects. So things such as dead leaves, dead organisms, and whatnot, they're going to collect at the top and decompose, and you're going to get this really nutrient dense soil on top. And the lower you go, the less nutrient dense the soil is going to be, uh, the less fine the soil is going to be. Um, uh, and the more sort of rocky it's going to be. That's how I like to think of it. So right below the horizon, which is the organic horizon, we have the A horizon. It's called the surface layer. Below that, we have the subsoil horizon. Sorry, the B horizon, which is subsoil layer. Below that, we have the C horizon, which is the substratum. And at the very bottom, we have the R horizon, which is bedrock. So just be familiar with what the soil horizons are and how at the very top, um, the soil is extremely nutrient dense. Um, and the lower you go on the soil horizons, the less nutrient dense it's going to be. Um, and the less presence of organic material there's going to be. Okay, so soil can is prone to erosion. So um, Several factors that lead to soil erosion are extreme environmental conditions. So this means like excessive water, wind, heat, just extreme conditions that the environment isn't accustomed to. Another thing that can cause soil erosion is the absence of vegetation, because what the vegetation does is the roots of the vegetation um, end up sort of locking that soil in, and it prevents it from washing away. Um, One way you can get rid of that vegetation is tillage, because you rip up the roots from the soil as you're turning the dirt, and this can also lead to soil erosion. Okay, here we have a picture taken during the Dust Bowl. So if you're not familiar with the Dust Bowl, it's pretty much, sorry, it's pretty much an instance in which farming practices were used uh, that weren't exactly environmentally friendly. And I say that because what ended up happening is farmers from the east moved out west towards the Great Plains, and they used their farming practices that got their that mixed success in the east. They used the same ones in the west, and what ended up happening is when they did things like till the soil, it got picked up by the wind, it got washed away by the water, until all the soil was that of the soil that was left was extremely poor soil, very low nutrient. Um, yeah, and it couldn't stay on the ground, the soil. So the wind would pick it up. As I said, the water would pick it up. So this is just one example of what can happen when you're not mindful of the soil and its ability to erode. Okay, so now let's look at soil composition. Um, let's start off with this diagram right here. So really the only three soil particles you need to be familiar with are these three right here, and that's because the soil triangle, which is this tool right here, which we'll talk about in just a second, uses these three particles, so they don't mention gravel. Okay, but nevertheless, um, the size of the soil particle is directly correlated to the porosity of the soil. So the porosity is how much water the soil allows to go through it. So just know that the larger the size of the particle, the more water it allows to go through it. Um, Vice versa, the smaller the particle, the less water. So a soil that's high in clay is going to be is going to let less water go through it than a soil that's mostly composed of gravel. And if you're familiar with soil composition, you know that a very sandy soil is going to allow water to drain through it very easily. And of course, I don't think I mentioned it before, but just know um, the soil particle size, and how clay is smaller than silt, which is smaller than sand, which is smaller than gravel. Okay, now let's move on to our soil triangle. Now you might find a lot of AP questions, especially multiple choice relating to the soil triangle. So I'm going to teach you how to read it real quick. It's pretty simple. Um, so the way you read the soil triangle is, first of all, you have the clay percent on the left side, silt percent on the right side, sand percent on the bottom. Now I'm not sure if these change position, but even if they did, it really doesn't matter. So um, the way to read the soil triangle is to first either look at the bottom or the side. So let's say, for example, so let's say the soil composition is composed of about 60% sand. So in this instance, we would look at the part of the triangle for sand, and we would go all the way up to the 60. Now what we would do here is we would follow the diagonal to the left. So in this circumstance, the diagonal would be right here. And let's say that same soil is composed of about, let's say, 20% silt. So we would go to silt and we would find the 20, and we would follow that diagonal. So the way you want to think about it is you want your diagonals intersecting, because all three diagonals have to intersect. So if you go along this diagonal, you'll find that it gets to a point where it bisects the other one. So it would bisect right here. Now, you can actually find, if you have two of the soil particle percentages, you can actually find the third without them telling you. All you have to do is add the two and then subtract it from 100. So if we have 60 and 20, we can also look at the diagram. But let's say we don't have access to the diagram. So it would be 60 plus 20, which is 80. Subtract that from 100, and that leaves you with 20. Because of course, if you have 20% clay, 60% sand, and 20% silt, that would make 100%. Now, let me find where it was. So it was right about here, right? So this soil is about treading the line between sandy loam and sandy clay loam. Let's look at a quick question similar to the one we just did. What soil composition consists of 30% clay, 40% sand, and 30% silt? Okay, so let's look at our triangle real quick. Let's start off with clay, because that's the first one they mentioned. So I'll give you a second to pause the video, see if you can do it. Okay, let's go through this problem. So let's start off with 30% clay. So here's 30% clay. We always go on the horizontal diagonal, I guess you would say, on this side. So 30% clay means we're on this line. Right after that, we have 40% sand. So if this soil is composed of 40% sand, we go to the sand, and we go to 40%. Now we know that we're on this diagonal for clay, so we just have to hit that with the sand. So 40% is going to hit at about right there. Okay, so you really don't even need to find the silt, but let's do it anyway. So silt would be 30%, and of course it should meet up with those other two. So you should have gotten clay loam as your answer. They can also ask you, they can also, for the AP test, they can also point to somewhere on the triangle and expect you to find the percentages. So pretty much what you want to do for that is just work backwards. It's pretty simple if you think about it. You know, you shouldn't be too worried about that section of the test. And another quick thing they mention on the College Board or on the AP test or just AP in general is that there's ways to test for your soil. So you can test for various things such as what type of nutrients and the concentration of nutrients that are in your soil. You can also test for the acidity of your soil or the pH of your soil. You can order those tests online. You can also do physical tests. but it's all pretty much to evaluate the composition of your soil. Okay, now moving on to layers of the atmosphere and global wind patterns. So here are the layers of the atmosphere. I would become familiar with this diagram and others like it. Okay, so let's go over it real quick. At the very bottom, we have the troposphere. This is pretty much where we live. It's the lowest to the earth. Right above that, we have the stratosphere. This is where things like aircrafts, clouds subside right under the stratosphere. And it's also where you're going to find your ozone layer. So, um, be familiar or at least know that the stratosphere is where you find the ozone layer. In the mesosphere, things like meteors shrivel up or at least, I guess, burn up. Um, they don't really get past the mesosphere. In the thermosphere, we have spacecrafts and the aurora borealis, things of that sort. And of course, the exosphere, this is where satellites orbit the planet. It's the furthest away from the Earth. Another thing the College Board wants you to be familiar with is how the temperature varies depending on which uh, layer you're in. So what ends up happening is closer to the ground, of course, um, the temperature is going to be higher, but the higher you go, the uh, lower the temperature is going to be. And of course, the temperature at sea level isn't going to be the same as on Mount Everest. But um, as you can see, as you climb, the temperature gets lower and lower, but somewhere past the mesosphere, the temperature actually starts to climb to insane numbers. Um, and scientists attribute this to a couple of things. You really don't have to be familiar with it, but just know that the temperature climbs or the temperature varies depending on which um, layer you're in. And also another thing you want to know is um, uh, the density of each layer varies. That is to say that the density decreases the higher up you go away from the Earth. And if you think about it, like I said before, the sea level, just like how the temperature at sea level is different from the temperature on Mount Everest, uh, the air is really thin up at Mount Everest, while the air is not as thin when you are at sea level. But um, that's on a very small scale. The air really thins out the higher and higher you go, to where in the thermosphere there's really no atmosphere, even though they consider it to be a part of the atmosphere. Okay, and now we're going to discuss wind currents. So wind currents, um, they occur sort of because of two things. First thing we're going to talk about is Hadley cells. So what ends up happening is the air that's away from the equator is going to be cooler because the sun gets the most direct sunlight at the equator, so the temperature is going to be warmer. So what ends up happening is that cool air, as it comes towards the equator, it's going to start warming up because it's heading towards the equator. And as air warms up, it becomes less dense, and because the air is less dense, it's going to rise. So as it becomes warmer and warmer, it gets to a point where it starts to rise again, right at the equator. And this sort of cycle ends up happening in which the hot air near the equator rises and goes towards the pole, and that cold air moves towards the equator. And that's pretty much where you get your wind currents from. But the direction, if it worked out like this, the wind current should always be, flowing in this direction, um, directly from the poles down to the equator and back. But that's really not how they occur. What actually ends up happening is something called the Coriolis effect. Now, this is pretty much the Coriolis effect, but there's a GIF that I want to show you that really demonstrates it perfectly. So, as I said, the wind currents are moving from the poles down to the equator in sort of a linear fashion. And as you can see here, that's pretty much what happens. But what really ends up happening is, um, this pattern right here. Uh, would occur if the Earth wasn't moving at all, right? If you think about it, um, even though the air is moving in a linear fashion, it's not attached to the Earth. So while the Earth rotates, that air is going to remain in a linear fashion. And what's going to end up happening is it's going to appear to curve simply because it's going on the same line while the Earth is spinning. Since the Earth is spinning while it's going on this line, you're going to have this curved effect. And that's pretty much where, our wind currents come from. They call that the Coriolis effect. So whenever they talk about the Coriolis effect, know that they're talking about this phenomenon right here. Okay, really quick, we're going to talk about watershed. So, the definition for a watershed is a geographic region where all runoff drains to. Okay, so a really quick recap of watersheds. It's pretty much an area, be it, you know, a huge lake or, the Atlantic Ocean, where all the water in an area drains to, as the definition states. So, um, what ends up happening is there's these watershed divides, and it divides watersheds. Um, and as the rain falls, it goes from the tops of the mountains all the way down through the tributaries and the rivers and everything, all the waterways that lead down to, either a lake or an ocean or whatnot. But as it goes down, it ends up carrying everything with it, right? So, the concept that the College Word wants you to know is that, let's say we have a city right through here, or a farm right over here. If there's a city, you have to understand that if it rains, all of that, whatever's in the city is gonna um, get right into the water and go all the way down drain right into the basin. Likewise, if you have a farm, um, up here in the watershed, all of that, um, all those nutrients and that fertilizer is going to end up in the waterways and they're going to end up in that basin. Here we have a prime example of a watershed in the area I live in. So here is the Delaware watershed, also called the Delaware River Basin. River basin and watershed are sort of like interchangeable. So yeah, so as you can see right up here, we have mountains and areas of high elevation. So when that water or when it rains and whatnot, all that water from uh, that rain is going to drain all the way down to areas of lower gravity until it reaches the end point, which in our case is the Atlantic Ocean. Okay, solar radiation and Earth seasons. So solar insolation, it's a concept I want you to understand. It's pretty much the amount of solar radiation the Earth receives. Now, an easy way to understand solar insolation is to conduct like a mini lab at your home. All you're going to need is a flashlight and a piece of paper. Now, the definition states that solar insolation is pretty much the energy that is twice as far from the sun is spread over 4 times in the area, making it 1/4 the intensity. So it pretty much means that the further away from the sun, the more spread out that energy is going to be, so the less intense. So if you if you look at the this mini lab, if we point a flashlight directly at a piece of paper, uh, perpendicular directly overhead, you're going to have a small area. Um, sorry, if you cast the light directly overhead, it's going to be less concentrated or more concentrated over less area, right? But if you put the flashlight on an angle, it's going to have to travel a longer distance. Um, So in turn, it's going to be spread out over a larger area. And of course, because of this, um, you're going to have less concentration. So one could say that the temperature, if you were to conduct this lab, you could check if the temperature um, in this area that's being hit with the light is going to be higher than the temperature in this area. So this all relates to the seasons of the Earth, and I say that because the Earth is tilted on an angle, and different parts of the year, uh, more different parts of the year, separate parts of the Earth are going to be in direct contact uh, with the sun, and when I say that, I mean um, that the sun uh, is, constantly projects light onto the earth, but depending on the year, because of the tilt of Earth's axis, uh, different parts of the earth are going to be receiving more sunlight than they would at different uh, parts of the year. So to simplify this a bit more, here's this diagram. So let's say you live in the northern hemisphere, more specifically North America. So um, in June, since you're tilted towards um, the sun, right, you're going to be in the most direct um, sunlight than if you were in winter. Now, since you're tilted away, because the sunlight has to travel a farther distance, um, the sunlight's going to be less intense. So that pretty much explains the seasons. Of course, you should um, have a more in-depth uh, or more knowledge on this, but I'll leave that to the College Board um, to help you out with that. This is just a brief synopsis of pretty much all you need to know uh, in for the AP test. Okay, geography and climate. So, a concept the AP test wants you to know is how coastal areas have less variation in temperature than areas that are more so inland. So the Association for Canadian Educational Resources states that large bodies of water, such as oceans, seas, and large lakes, affect the climate of an area. Water heats and cools more slowly than land. Therefore, in the summer, the coastal regions will stay cooler, and in winter, warmer. A more moderate climate with smaller temperature range is created. So, we should know from chemistry that water has a high specific heat. If you don't know that, specific heat is pretty much the amount of heat something is able to obtain. Um, so water has a high specific heat. And because of those hydrogen bonds in the water molecules, it's able to retain that heat more so than land can. So what ends up happening is, let's say, um, it's really high temperature, and the water receives a lot of heat, and so does the land. They receive the same amount of heat. What ends up actually happening is while the land will cool off, the water will retain that heat more so that it will actually warm the land or at least keep the temperatures from oscillating as much as they would if they were inland. So here's an example of that happening. So as you can see, in areas where there's really no body of water, like large body of water, there's high oscillations in temperature, while in areas near bodies of water, the oscillations in temperature are less uh, pronounced, I would say. So, yeah, for example, uh, right here, as you can see around the Great Lakes, the oscillations in temperature are less, there's less variation in temperature than over here. And even though it might appear that there's a body of water around uh, America's southern border, um, right here is actually Mexico. And here's the coast right here. So this would explain why the temperature varies by so much. It's simply because areas inland without um, a large body of water is not going to have that water to stabilize its temperatures like somewhere either around a coast or like near a Great Lake or a river or something of that sort. Okay, and now let's move on to the rain shadow effect. So the rain shadow effect is pretty much so uh, what ends up happening when you have something like a mountain um, next to the coast is as that wind from uh, the ocean, the wind current, uh, it's going to be really high in humidity um, simply because it's over the ocean. And because it's high in humidity, it's going to tend, when it hits this, it's going to tend to rise. Um, or, sorry, it's going to tend to, when it hits the mountain, it's going to rise. And because it's high in humidity, um, as the air rises, it's going to cool, which is going to allow the air to condense. And when it condenses, it's going to precipitate. So then all that air, all that humidity in the air is drawn out by the time it gets to the other side of the mountain. And by the time it gets to the other side, all that air is going to be dry, not humid, um, and the wind current continues, but the air is going to be much more dry. Here's a prime example of that occurring in Washington State, right near Portland. So we have uh, westerly trade winds blowing humid or uh, yeah, humid air um, across Washington. But there's a mountain range right in between that prevents that air from going straight across. What actually ends up happening, like I mentioned before, is that the air has to rise. As it rises, cools. The water molecules in the air condense. It precipitates on this side, and here um, is your um, harsh environment as a result of humid or as a result of the lack of humidity in the air because the air is going to be really, really, really dry. Oh, and before I forget, some concepts or at least some vocabulary you need to be familiar with is that the side where the air is humid and the wind is hitting the mountain, that's called the windward side. And after all that air loses its humidity and goes onto this side, this is called the leeward side. Okay, so finally we have El Nino and La Nina, Nina. Uh, so these are pretty much phenomenon that happen every 3 to 7 years in the Pacific Ocean, more specifically this region of the Pacific Ocean. Um, so usually the wind currents and the water currents go from west to east, or I'm sorry, east to west, uh, for normal conditions. But what ends up happening when, yeah, so here are the normal conditions. It's going from east uh, to west, uh, and all that warm air is moving to the west, right? But every so often, something, um, an El Nino occurs in which it's moving from west to east. And what you have to know about Nino is that the warmer climates are going to be more to the east, so that we're thinking like the east coast of South America and whatnot. Sorry, the west coast of South America. Um, and there's going to be less uh, like biological activity in this area simply because what ends up happening with the normal conditions is that as the water travels, the warm water travels on the surface, and then the cold water travels underneath back towards um, the east. That cold water is going to bring up a whole bunch of nutrients and whatnot right in the to the western coast of South America. So when El Nino happens, there's an absence of that upheaval of nutrients as a result of cold water, since it's traveling in the opposite direction. So what ends up happening is, as it's traveling in the opposite direction, um, the water goes down, and that prevents that upheaval of nutrients from occurring. Um, I haven't discussed La Nina yet, but it's pretty much the same thing as normal conditions. However, it's just more um, prominent. So the winds are going to be stronger heading towards this direction. The current's going to be stronger. The water current's going to be stronger. And you're also going to see more of that, more biological activity, simply because uh, everything's enhanced. So it's this La Nina is the same thing as normal conditions, but pretty much everything is just enhanced. So these are what to expect with excuse me, um, sort of a El Nino sort of condition in which this area is wet and warm, wet and warmer than usual. Uh, and this area is drier than usual, drier and warmer. Uh, just know that, um, you know, if you think about it logically, El Nino, um, it's pretty much bringing all that warm air and warm water to the east coast or the west coast of South America. So, traditionally, all that warm air and warm water is heading this way, towards the Australia area. Um, but in El Nino, everything's just swapped pretty much. And La Nina is the same thing as uh, normal conditions, just more enhanced. So you're going to have really wet, really humid conditions in this area. You're going to have drier, um, less humid conditions in this area. And as for North America, you want to know that it's going to be warmer in this area because of jet currents um, during El Nino, and um, wetter in this area and wet and cooler during El Nino. And then when there's a La Nina, it's going to be drier in this area and cooler up top. Okay, and that about ends it for Unit 4. Make sure to leave a like, uh, subscribe, and I'll see you on the next video.